This is the most famous portrait in the world. So famous that I know that you know what it's called. It's an oil painting and it's heavily retouched. I don't mean the picture was altered, but reality was altered as it was painted. Because if it weren't retouched, she'd have veins on the back of her hands, freckles on her cheeks, wrinkles around her eyes, and there'd be stray hairs flying all over the place. Because she's human. As I unretouch this portrait, as I reverse engineer it in software, it becomes clear how many details Da Vinci must have left out of his work. Why didn't he show her minute flaws? More importantly, why should the modern photographer feel obliged to leave them in? Does retouching a portrait move it closer to or further from reality? 300 years after Da Vinci's masterpieces, chemical photography came along and cameras made a more complete record of the scenes in front of them. As soon as photography was used for portraits, an army of retouchers arose ready to modify negatives to please paying customers. With improvements to lenses and emulsions, the tiny details that were desirable in landscapes and still lifes also became apparent in portraits. These details weren't found in the painted portraits people were familiar with. So early retouchers used pencils and knives to shape raw photographs into presentable products. It's amazing that today's digital retouching techniques were all known and practiced pretty much since the birth of photography in the mid-1800s. Not all retouchers had a stellar reputation though. Nothing could be more appalling than to produce a negative and have it ruined by a retoucher. No wonder the artists and the public decry retouching. Even photographers who object to photo manipulation wouldn't think twice before making a global correction, like changing the brightness or contrast when post-processing. It's still a manipulation, but because it affects the whole image at once, we seem more willing to accept the change. It's done to restore an image to the photographer's memory of what the scene ought to look like. Remember that bit for later. Retouching is when changes are made locally. This could be brightness and contrast as well, but in discrete areas, or it could be removing an element or smoothing an outline. Retouching is putting the work of human hands into the final image. Maybe it's further from the naked truth, but closer to the photographer's impression of what the picture ought to be. People's opinion on retouching is only as positive or as negative as their own experience. Some hastily condemn retouching because they've seen examples of bad work, writes the editor of The Practical Photographer in 1904. But to judge any procedure from cases of defective manipulation would equally condemn all photography from our occasional failures. The word retouch might invoke images of celebrities in glossy magazines, but it might make you think of repairing old damaged prints of your relatives, similar to the realm of painting where retouching means restoration or preservation of an artwork. Is it manipulative or miraculous? Sufficiently, you could use subjectivity as an excuse. Some would argue that scientific truth is not necessarily artistic truth, but it might not be as cut and dry as that. Time was when retouching was regarded as little short of sacrilege. This was written in the Photographic News in 1866, less than 30 years after the first photographs were taken. The possession of artistic beauty, it was alleged, could never compensate for the loss of photographic truth. But it was overlooked that the defects of a photograph often militated against truth as much as against beauty. An untouched photograph can't be trusted. Why on earth not? Well, two reasons: perception and contraptions. Let us bear in mind that when we look at the human face, we do not gaze at it intently with a view to discover the minute spots and freckles, the tiny moles with a difference in colour, or the grain of skin. We take in the face as a whole, explains C.H. Hewitt in The Practical Photographer. This is the issue. We aren't programmed to remember every visual detail of the people we interact with. It's the setting of hair and dress and the constant play of facial muscles forming the varied expressions that attracts our attention, much more than the minutiae of detail. Hence, in the photograph, by the elimination of many of the things we expect and usually see in the face itself, what remains is emphasized and brought prominently to our notice. The still photograph without the possibility of interaction, it's unfair because we can study human features in a way we'd never do in real life. As vicious animals, we love to find imperfections in others, and we're hunting for them, and plenty of careless portraits feed that side of us. Here's an untouched portrait, but it's not in a studio, it's in my front room. The lie is simply where I pointed the lens. I can choose the lens, the lighting, and what the sitter's doing, and the honest camera will catch all of my lies. But that assumes that the cameras are honest. Have you ever healed a dust spot or a dead pixel on your sensor? What about drying marks or scratches from a film scan? These are the literal defects we retouch without giving a thought to ethics. But wait, there's more. The old adage that the camera cannot lie has been proved to be untrue, writes Clarence Ponting in The Amateur Photographer in 1919. Retouching simply means the application of handwork to remedy the defects caused by the photographic method. Photographic contraptions are not saintly. Most people assume cameras spit out the truth. Nowhere near. After explaining how different wavelengths of light are affected by lenses and perceived by the human eye, Edward Young in Photo Era from 1920 wrote, "My contention is that photographic image is a false image, and hence it's necessary to correct it very largely by retouching." He gives the example that violet reflections from skin photograph very quirky, and when you use a reflector it doesn't get into the corner of the eye socket, and most wrinkles are exaggerated. Here's the necessity for retouching to correct this defect. Early photographers were especially concerned about freckles because the black and white emulsions at the time rendered light freckles as dark spots. Reality was not properly captured in the negative. There are other issues that are out of the photographer's control, like patchy colour on skin, shininess from perspiration, or small reflections on a pair of glasses. Small issues which are barely noticeable in the moment, but when a picture's stationary and viewed close up, they become a distraction when the viewer should be concerned with the message of the photograph. Remember, we're not talking about modification to the point of transformation. Retouching needs some boundaries. The word retouching might trigger you to think of heavily modified bodies and faces on magazine covers and social media. Not my cup of tea, and I'm not endorsing it. My intent with portraits is to honour, not to deceive. At the other extreme, there's photojournalism, snapshots of friends and family, and crime scene photography where retouching is close to non-existent, as it should be. It all depends on where a photo sits on the scale of documentation to art. An official passport photo shouldn't be retouched, but it makes for a lousy movie poster. If we're comfortable addressing the mechanical and perceptual problems of photography, along with the short-lived distractions in the frame, then what would be beyond the scope of conscientious retouching? I'll make some suggestions. Complete removal of characteristic marks to the point it destroys every sense of a likeness. That's the antithesis of a portrait. John Brushwood in The Professional and Amateur Photographer in 1900 said, "Today the successful retoucher is able to improve the negative, not detract therefrom, by destroying the little fine points the operator has laboured so hard to obtain." Then there's changing body shapes and sizes. Flattering a sitter is one thing, but we don't want to be misleading. Heavy smoothing, which stems from poor technique or the desire to retouch as quickly as possible. It results in a cheap-looking picture. It's the extremist or the one without feeling who aims simply at making the negative perfectly smooth all over. Lastly, there's change for the sake of change. That's a symptom of not having the result pre-visualized. Bad retouching, like cheap AI filters, don't know when it's gone too far. We're aiming to correct and improve an image without leaving brushstrokes. And in conclusion, don't forget that retouching must never show. For every retouching technique, there's a real-world equivalent to fix problems before the picture's taken. We can pre-touch to avoid a retouch. Soft focus lenses are the equivalent of pulling down the clarity slider. It's a softer look without making things appear out of focus. Waiting a week for a pimple or scratch to heal would save you using the healing tool. Ask your sitter to show up only when their skin is perfect all over. Makeup acts to smooth out skin and conceal blemishes. Printing on textured paper does a good job of evening out a picture too. Distracting items can be physically removed on location rather than using a clone stamp. Changing lenses changes the crop in camera. Altering the angle of the camera and the distance to the subject can correct unwanted exaggerated proportions. It's a perspective problem that usually calls for some clever warping in post. On-set lighting can draw the eyes to or from certain areas of the frame. Dodging and burning does the same thing in post. The old retouchers called it modelling. Fitted clothing or an optimised pose can prevent the need to warp bumpy outlines. If we take care of any one of these problems before the shutter button's pressed, is that all that different from addressing it afterwards? Pre-touching can be as simple as combing the sitter's hair or as complicated as having a barber on set. What about a dentist or a surgeon? It'd mean we wouldn't have to retouch, but it's not cost effective or time effective, and I'm not sure if it's any more ethical either. There's a feedback loop that benefits the photographer though. Imagine spending a long time in software removing lipstick from a tooth or correcting an unflattering shadow. The frustration may lead you to look for the same problem on the next shoot to make sure you don't have to correct it again. The retouching process just improved your studio technique. You know through experience what to look for. Through retouching, we reduce the need for retouching. Edward Young gives a practical anecdote. Often, a photographer is asked to supply photographs without retouching. I did it once, taking the lady at her word. She got a fright, and I lost a good customer. Clients paying for a professional portrait don't want a half-baked product. They want to look their best. Not different, but their best. Wilson French sympathises. No person can be blamed for wishing to look their best, and especially in a photograph, which is subject to inspection and criticism more than the original. Portraits for business, publication, websites, and wall art will almost always benefit from judicious retouching. I definitely had stronger opinions against retouching before I thought about the implications of not retouching. An unretouched picture takes less time, less effort, and less education, so it's very tempting early on, especially when my retouching attempts looked terrible. I want to know about your retouching boundaries. Let me know in the comments below who you take pictures of and where you draw the line between making corrections to a photograph and tweaks that go too far.